This morning's full program of classes dedicated by Sari and Shlomo Drazen. Shlomo Drazen went to yeshiva with me, and I think we went to camp together as kids long before that. So say hello to Shlomo for me. And love memories of Sari's father, Mr. Joe Polanski. There you go. Okay, got it. Zichron Livracha, husband of Roseanne Polanski, on the occasion of his yahrzeit. So he should have an Ilui Neshama. And if I would have known, I would have made the share better. That's true. Okay, so let's try to learn. I'm going to do something which is completely irresponsible right now, and that is, I know there were some rabbis who love somebody must have told them in rabbinical school that whenever you start teaching or Torah or drasha, you should always start with a joke. Now, most of them don't know what a joke is, which is why this doesn't always work out that well. But not only am I going to say a joke, I'm going to say a scientific joke, which so limits it. And the other problem with all of this is that I'm going to have people who are going to call me and write me and contact me and tell me how I didn't understand the science at all. But it's okay. It's okay. Because I'm going to add in one word to the title, which is going to then limit their ability to comment. But I get way ahead of myself. So it goes something like this. And you can use this, make various adjustments to it. But it goes something like this. A man walks into a library. Gil, you listen? This is going to be this is the most important part of the shir. A man walks into a library and says, "Do you have a book on Pavlov's dog and Schrödinger's cat?" And the librarian says, "It rings a bell, but I'm not sure if I do or I don't." Okay. Now, the truth is that is hilarious. If you don't realize why it's funny, so no, what can I do? But it has very much to do with what I'm going to talk about today. So I think even the title is going to end up being, I already told you the title, so it's scary now because I'm limited. The title is going to be Schrödinger's Theological Cat. That's what we're calling it. So that's what I said. Once I threw the word theological in, and somebody says, you don't understand science, I'm going to counter and say, well, you don't understand theology. So, Gamarnu. You know what? I can even do it better. Yeah, exactly. Maybe we could do it even better and call it his metaphysical cat, but we don't want to do that. Theological is good enough. So with that, let's begin. Vayikra Yaakov el banav vayomer heyasvu vagida lachem et asher yikra etchem b'acharit hayamim. Yaakov is on his deathbed. He gathers together his children, at least his sons, and he says, heyasvu, gather, vagida lachem, and I'm going to tell you, et asher yikra etchem, that which will occur to you, b'acharit hayamim, at the end of days. Now, I could have made all of this really simple, easy, straightforward, not complex, no intrigue, by interpreting, so what exactly does this mean, ba'acharit hayamim? And real simple. Just read the next number of verses, whatever Yaakov says, that's what Yaakov meant. Now, that's what I just now did was I demystified and I took away any question. I want a definition of what Acharit Yamim means. Simple. Acharit Yamim means whatever it is that Yaakov says afterwards, and that is by definition, and therefore everything is fine. Nonetheless, there is this persistent approach that what Yaakov did over here is what we would call today, if we move over from religion to science to business, we would call this a bait and switch. You advertise one thing and then you give something else. So therefore he says, by the way, great plan, another thing for rabbis, make the title good, right? Forget about the joke. Make the title good. So over here, in this class, we're going to reveal what's going to happen at the end of days. So again, there are certain people who are going to be quite interested in what's going to happen at the end of days. We all want to be able to reveal mysteries and so on and so forth. But over here, is Yaakov guilty of a bait and switch? Or whatever it is that Yaakov said he was going to do is what he does. He then doubles down. He kaptsu, gather together. Again, there would be room to analyze what's heasfu, what is hikaptsu. Right? You realize the word kibbutz, right? To gather also is from the word hikaptsu, the word heasfu, lasof. So they're most likely different. So there are commentaries that then will deal what the difference is. Vishimu b'nei Yaakov, vishimu el Yisrael avichem. Come, listen to b'nei Yaakov, listen to Yisrael. We always have the suspicion Yaakov is the more personal name, Yisrael is the more national name, and therefore if he's telling us national secrets, what's going to be? And then he moves into Ruvain b'choriata, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to say it again. I could just use my definition of Acharit Hayamim in whatever it is that Yaakov says. Yaakov is honest, especially on his deathbed. He tells exactly what he means, exactly what he thinks, and everything is good. Or I could start looking at the Midrashim and start looking at the commentators, who then will take this in a completely different direction. Parshat Rabin, source number 2, Et asher yikratchem b'achrit yamim, Rav Simon Amar Mapelet Gog Hera Lahem. That he, by the way, according to this, he actually succeeds. He does tell them, he does show them. He shows them about the end of days, about the war between Gog and Magog. At least it says Gog over here. If you want a nice English word for that, you can call it Armageddon from Gog and Magog. And he shows him, again, all the drama that takes place at the end of days. And we'll skip a little bit. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Binyan Beit HaMikdash Hara Lahem, which is a little bit more positive. Does he show him the destruction or show him the building of the Beit HaMikdash? And it says, why? Because it says, Vayaba Achri Tamim Yeher Beit Hashem Nachon. Because there's a verse in Micha that actually relates the term Achrit Hayamim together with the building of the Beit HaMikdash, our theory of conservation of Achrit Hayamim, and now we see that it's clearly talking about the building of the Beit HaMikdash. Rabbanan Amrei Balagalot Lahem Et HaKetz. He wanted to tell them about the Kates. Now, the word Kates is I want to be a little careful about right now, because even when I use the word Kates, the question is, what does that mean? V'nit kasami menu, and it was hidden from him. So the word Kates would mean the end. The question is, what exactly does it mean? Maybe we'll come later on today back to I think, again, off the top of my head, there were two usages in the Chumash prior to this. One is with Kahn and Hevel, and the other, which is the word Miketz, which the Parsha Miketz, and both of them we have at the end of a period of time. And what does that mean? It probably means at the end of a period of time. So over here, Haketz, but generally when we talk about it, again, especially in theological circles, we'll talk about Ketz. Ketz will mean the end of days. Again, by the way, Achrit Hayamim. Haketz means he's going to tell them, aside from telling them about, according to one opinion, Armageddon, and according to another opinion, the building of the Beit HaMikdash, but rather reveal the time frame for it. So Haketz would be to deal with the time frame. Good. If we look at Rashi in source 3, V'agidalachem bikesh lagalot et haketz, he wanted to tell them about, again, the time frame of v'nistakami menu shchina v'tchil omer dvarim achirim. And at that point, according to Rashi, his clairvoyance suddenly disappears, and he finds himself unable to articulate and unable to say or to show or to communicate anything. And then, according to this, there is a bait and switch, which again, it's not deliberate, but instead he just starts talking about Uvein b'choriatam, which is, according to Rashi, the speech that Yaakov gives, or what we call, quote unquote, the blessings that Yaakov gives in Vayichi, is not what he intended to say. It's not what he intended to communicate. What he intended to communicate, suddenly he was lost in a cloud, and he just could not say what he wanted to say. What Rashi doesn't tell us, at least in this short little phrase, is when he says, Kate's the end of days, which end of days is he referring to? And I will explain in a moment. The Mizrahi, the Re'im, who is generally one of the many commentators on Rashi, but among all the commentaries, one of the most important commentaries on Rashi. If you don't know this, there's a whole sub-industry of Rashi commentators. And again, first foremost is the Re'im, and he says, Bikesh lagalot haketz, and he says, source is Parshat Rabbi, as we just now saw. He said, I don't know why in the world they felt it necessary to go down this path. Again, why even say that Yaakov didn't say what he intended to say? There's no indication over here from the text itself. That he told them, by the way, essentially Ram is saying, why don't you say the text is completely authentic in terms of Yaakov's motivation of what he had wanted to communicate. So he's saying, I don't understand this. And at the end he writes, V'ulai Kabbalah hayta biyadam, which is like his only way, because really he's scratching his proverbial head and say, I don't know why they're doing this. And then he says, maybe there's a tradition. Because if you have a tradition that that's what happened, so then what can you say? You have a tradition. So essentially what he's saying is, if you have a tradition that that's what it means, then I'm willing to accept it. Otherwise, I don't know why you're making this whole thing more complicated than it needs to be. The Gur Aryeh, number 5, and who's the Gur Aryeh? Another commentary on Rashi who often quotes the Re'im. He actually is far more famous than most of the commentaries on Rashi. The Gur Aryeh is the Maharal from Prague. And he says, Bikesh legalot haketz, kimashmut hakatuv, v'gida lachem et asher yikra etchem be'acharit hayamim. He says, I'm going to tell you what's happened at the end of days. V'lo matzanu sheyikra matayim shana achrit hayamim. So what he's doing over here is he's saying is, hold it a second. What Yaakov refers to in the actual speech, a lot of the tribes, he talks about the land that they're going to settle in, the things they're going to do in that land. And he says, 200 years down the line, where do we ever find that means that is Acharit Hayamim? B'dorot rishim shchayum hein 150 shana, and so on. So he's saying, I don't understand how you could claim that Acharit Hayamim is Yaakov's authentic speech, because that phrase is what pushes me to those interpretations that we saw, again, for example, in the Midrash about the building of the Beit HaMikdash, go far off in the future. If you were to look carefully at source 6 and 7, or 6 and 7, it is the Targum Yonatan, or the Pseudo Yonatan, and he lumps together all kinds of things. Meaning, it's not just that Yaakov was going to reveal, Yaakov was going to reveal everything. So, V'yikra in 7, V'yikra Yaakov l'banav, v'yomer lahem, hitaharu mitum'at, prepare yourself, like go to mikveh. Sodot stumim, I'm going to tell you all the secrets, kitzim, and all the exact timeline, gnuzim, which is hidden. Umatan scharam shel tzadikim v'onshim shel reshaim. I'll reveal to you why the good suffer and why the bad are rewarded. All the mysteries in the world, which means once we're going to reveal mysteries, let's just go all the way and reveal every single mystery. The Oneg shel Eden, and what the reward is going to be in the Garden of Eden, Mahu ke'echad mitaseh, and so on and so forth. Which means essentially, Ketz shel atid melech hamashiach lavo kusami menu v'kach amar bo v'agid lechem ma shikra etchem b'sof yamim. And he wanted to tell them also about Mashiach and so on, and then suddenly he lost the station. he wasn't able to focus in. The communication stops, and Yaakov is unwilling. So again, we love this. We love the Targum Yonatan. Again, not really Yonatan, but we love this Targum. We love, again, once we're going down the path that we're going to reveal things, let's reveal everything, which is essentially what he does. In source number 8, the Radak, he understands that end of days means the end of the exile, the current exile. Which means, let's just think for a second. We're looking back at this thousands of years later, after a first Beit HaMikdash and a first exile, and a second Beit HaMikdash and a second exile, and then through all the trials and tribulations, the vicissitudes of Jewish history, going through, again, all of the suffering and all of the problems, and the few celebrations and the incredible scholarship, but nonetheless, going through the Crusades and the pogroms and the Chmielnicki massacre and the Holocaust and the building of the State of Israel, and Yaakov sees all of these things, or all of these things dependent upon all kinds of other factors which had taken place subsequently. And what Yaakov is really talking about is the current challenge that the Jewish people find themselves in, and that is that they've made their way to Egypt, but they're going to get out of Egypt. And that's the end of days, which means that's the whole thing. And now you read the Radak, ve'ezeh inyano kishikansu lirishtav amar lehem beruach hanivua ktsat me'asher yikra etchem yesh bechelkotam v'yesh b'atzlachatam v'milchama im aveihem v'ad Yehuda zecher, and so on. He's talking about the immediate things. Rav ben Rambam goes in the same direction. He says, Ach Yetziat Mitzrayim v'Rushat Haaretz, What's it talking about? The end of days is when they leave Egypt and go and enter into the land of Israel. That's the end of days, which means why argue any further? So I'm just going to point out now that we've till this point have seen a number of different approaches. And now you also realize by Rashi only saying he wanted to reveal the Kates, there is definitely room regarding Rashi, at least in that phrase. Which Kates? Are you talking about the end of the Egyptian exile? Or are you talking about the arrival of Mashiach? Which means there's lots and lots of dates along the way that it's not that clear what it is that Rashi had intended. And I'm going to say it again, at least regarding that particular phrase in Rashi. The Ramban in source 10, Mashiach. Okay? Anybody know where that sound is coming from? Or okay. The Ramban ba'achrit hayamim hem yemot Mashiach. Ki Yaakov yirmoz aleim b'dvarav k'mo she'amar ad ki yavo Shilo v'lo yikatamim. And he says if you read Yaakov's words carefully, you realize that there are some hints to the Messianic era. And he adds v'rabotenu amru. Again, now, but see, this is interesting for the Ramban. The Ramban doesn't always say, well, Chazal said it and that's the end of the discussion. He does not do that. Sometimes he says, Chazal said this, and this is what I think. But over here, he wants to end the argument and say, but look in the Gemara. Shabikesh legalot et haketz. V'nistakam imenu shchina kilu divrei hakol acharit yamim yimot Mashiachim. And he says, absolutely, according to everybody, whenever it says acharit yamim, it means the Messianic age. By the way, you've already noticed not everybody necessarily agrees with that. In source 11, and it's called the Tzedel Derech, it's in the 1500s. He's not the only one to go down this path. He goes back after the Ra'im, who says, I have no idea why they're arguing. We go, just say that Yaakov was authentic. Well, he's pointing out, well, it is the Midrash. We now know it's also the Gemara. And he then adds in, why don't you just look in the Ramban? And the aim is after the Ramban. V'tamaheni lama lo zachar v'lo pakad klal ma shekatov Ramban zal shehirgish b'zeh v'katav ki divrei hakol achridim yimot Mashiach ad kan l'shono. So the first thing he says is you're having a hard time because it says achrit yamim. So achrit yamim, that's what it means. That's how we take it. That's what the term uses. Although the Ramban, I believe, may have overstated his argument. Because it's always hard to say, according to everybody, this is what any particular term means. I can say most, I can say many, I can say usually, I can say that's what I would expect, but to say everybody is a little harder. Although you can say everybody, never doesn't say it is wrong. Skip a little bit. Because he says there are other uses. That's what he shows here. There are other usages of Acharit Yamim, which does not mean the Messianic age. So he says maybe the when Ramban said this, he meant over here. And we'll skip a little bit. And he goes into a bit, if you're interested, the difference perhaps between Hey Asfu versus Hikaptsu. And as I said, you'll at least know where to look. The Rabbeinu Bachaye, and he's very influenced by the Ramban generally. The Rabbeinu Bachaye knows both traditions, and he tells us that most likely it's talking about both. And then he makes a great argument, and he tells us that after all, the final redemption is actually, to a certain extent, I don't want to say completely, but it's to a certain extent based upon the first redemption. So certain principles of what takes place in terms of leaving Egypt and so on and so forth is the footprint which the future redemption is going to follow. So therefore, looking back at the earlier sources, rather than being pigeonholed into saying an either or, to borrow a term from Kierkegaard, we're already doing science, we could do philosophy today, rather than doing an either or by saying either it's talking about leaving Egypt and the end of those days, or it's talking about the Messianic days, he's saying, but these things are interrelated, and therefore I can end up saying that no, it's really dealing with both because of this interconnection between the two of them. Good. Good. Source 13, you can easily be fooled because it sounds like a midrash, the Seichel Tov, because it is a midrash, but it's a late midrash. It's a midrash which was, you'll see, was written by Rabbi Menachem, by Rabbi Shlomo, 1139. So again, realize it's after Rashi. What he does is he collects midrashim, but he also weaves through certain things. But we'll just say acharit yamim, ilu nemar ba'acharit yamim, hayiti omer b'sof hadarot, avakashu omer ba'acharit hayamim. So that's really interesting because he says there's a difference between the end of days and the end of the days, right? Because so the end of days, that's the end of days, but the end of the days could very well be the end of this particular quagmire which they find themselves in, whereby they are stuck in a land which isn't theirs, and they find themselves soon to be enslaved and abused, and so on and so forth. Which exactly leads me to source 14, which is one of the Balei Tosfot, the Chizkuni. Bacharit hayamim lo ne'amar ela hayamim. Heim mevuarim kfar shekava kadosh baruch hu la'Avraham zikni zman avodat arba ma'od shana v'brit bein abtarim. Now, this is obvious. I'll translate and I'll explain, but this is more complicated than the Chizkuni right now is letting on. First of all, you now realize that at this point in time, same time as the Seichel Tov and the Balei Tosfot, the Chizkuni, they all notice this thing about Acharit Yamim versus Acharit Hayamim, but they just brought another element into it, and this is the main point that we need to focus on, and then we'll see how it impacts everything. But this is the main point, and that is that there was an appointed time. And that appointed time is communicated in the Brit Bein HaBtarim. And the Brit Bein HaBtarim is, again, the most important prophecy in the book of Bereshit, because it sets then the timeline, and it sets what needs the checklist, what needs to be done, taking us through the end of Bereshit, through at least the first part of the book of Shemot, but the reality is it takes us through the end of Shemot and through Vayikra Bamidbar until we enter into the land of Israel in the beginning of Yoshua, which means the Brit Bein HaBtarim is not just the timeline, it's the goal of what is supposed to take place, it's the plan. But there's something more complicated here, and that is if we were to go back and take a quick look at the Brit Bein HaBtarim, which we won't at this moment, but we do know that the timeline is complicated because there it says indeed 400 years, but it also says the fourth generation, which means that, we'll borrow another term now, there's something about the time regarding the amount of servitude, slavery, being in a land which isn't theirs, and so on and so forth, which is fungible. Which means there are things which we can go and interpret the times in different ways. And yes, we're aware that there is this really interesting rabbinic teaching that, and you can read this as pshat in the Torah, that it's from the time that your descendants will be strangers in a land which isn't theirs, and it starts with the birth of Yitzchak, and that takes you exactly to 400 years, exactly more or less, to 400 years, till they leave Egypt. So I'm saying that becomes, that Yitzchak is a stranger in a land which isn't his. Again, as I pointed out months ago, was the biggest proof is that when Sarah dies, there's no place to bury her. When you live in your own land, you have your own cemetery. When it comes to finding a wife for Yitzchak, there's no girls appropriate in this country. Why? Because this is the land which isn't yours. I'm just saying it's really clear right there with the life of Yitzchak that he lives in a land which isn't his. And the taking of the 400 years to Yitzchak, as I said, it is compelling. Nonetheless, there's all kinds of other interesting things. And maybe even as I was talking, it triggered in your mind something, Hashem chishev et haketz. The 400 years, the word ketz, kuf, and tzadi is 190. You take away 190 from 400, you 210. And therefore, we've all been taught that the slavery was only 210 years. They were in Egypt because, as I said, it's fungible and God could be creative and God gets the final right to interpret these things in any way that he sees fit. But at least now we realize that there is this whole approach which is coming and saying, like, essentially, really, like, what are you talking about? Chizkuni, yeah, it has to do with the Brit Bein HaBtarim. Again, and that should be really straightforward and understood. If you look now at the Datsakenim, again, Baliatosa, like the Chizkuni, Eita Sheid Chadchem, Pirish Besof Abramot Vishloshim Shana, Shel Galut Mitzrayim. That 30 years is when they left, it added that 30 years. And their claims is that it's 430 since God said it to Abraham, but it was 400 since the birth of Yitzchak. Right? Again, difference between Hayamim and Yamim. If you want to say the end of days, you say B'achrit Yamim, not Hayamim. Vishamati, I've heard those who've argued B'achrit Yamim Shel Kadosh Baruch Hu Dainu B'Sof Chameshet Elafim, the end of 5,999 years. And I've heard those who claim that we're talking about the end of days. Ubikesh Yaakov L'Galot HaKetz V'Nistakam Yimenu Shechina. And again, some claim. So again, they're comfortable with pointing out that essentially you can. One is the approach I think is more authentic, and the other are those who've argued. And then he says something which is, I'm sorry if I call this cute, but it's interesting as well. Well, so it says that he lost his ability to prophesy, and he wondered, so instead of taking responsibility himself and saying, oh, why is God no longer talking to me? He says, why is my audience not deserving of receiving this information? And he says, but they are sinless. By the way, that gets us to a real problem. Because these people, you're already shaking your head, these people are not necessarily as sinless. And that takes us, of course, to this other topic that we don't want to talk about. And that is, does Yaakov know about Mechirat Yosef? Does he not know about Mechirat Yosef? Whose interest would have been to told him or not? The brothers are going to claim later on that, of course, Yaakov knew about it and said not to take any revenge and so on and so forth. But Yaakov looks and he says, but they have no chet, right? Hello, ein b'em chet. Klomar, ein b'kol shemot hashvatim lo chet v'lo tet. If you look at all the names of all of the, which will be a problem. There's no chet. But listen to the answer. Hishiva ruach hakodesh gam ein b'kol otiyot shmot hashvatim lo kuf v'lo tzadi. There's no kates either. So therefore, it is such an interesting, even though some people don't like this, it is such an interesting back and forth over here, is that they don't have chet, but they also don't have kates, which I just have to stop right here. So what does it mean they don't have kates and therefore you have no right to reveal this, or they don't have kates and there's no kates? I know I'm not being clear, so I want to try to be clearer. Has God already decided how the 400 years will be interpreted? Which means I've already showed you that there's different ways of doing this, and God has the prerogative of taking divine word and prophecy and applying it in ways that God thinks is right. And I'll add one more phrase, at that particular moment. So over here, that they're undeserving of the kate, so they're undeserving of it being revealed, or they're undeserving of getting time off for good behavior. Maybe this idea of getting some time off and God creatively interpreting it in a more lenient way, maybe that doesn't exist yet. So I hope what I just now said is a little bit more interesting. If you look at source 16, and again, this will more be for homework for you, but just realize that the Rekanati in source 16 is one of the, as I said, we have commentaries on Rashi. He's one of the commentaries on the Ramban. And especially when the Ramban ventures into mystical theory, the Rekanati loves explaining the mystical theory. But over here, he does something which, again, I'm not sure if it's in the Ramban, but it's really interesting. And let me just talk in general terms for a moment. The brothers, as of this point, were guilty of something profound, and that was Mechirat Yosef. Good. All of us are aware of something, and what we're aware of, by the way, is really interesting that we know it and how we know it. Essentially, it is theology being communicated by liturgy. That itself is just an interesting topic. I'm sure someone can spend an entire year teaching how there are theological questions, and the way the words in our davening decide an argument which existed either in the Gemara or Midrashim or even among Rishonim, that they go different ways, and it decides in a certain way. And by the way, sometimes these things are decided in a way that not everybody's comfortable with. Probably the best example in some of the slichot and even some of the prayers before Tkiyat Shofar, it speaks about roles of angels that not everybody agrees with and not everybody will say. And they'll take out those phrases and take out those words because they say theologically we don't accept that as a bona fide teaching. But I'll say it again, there are certain things that we know theologically because of liturgy, and it doesn't mean it doesn't exist in other places, but it means that it decided to absolutely go in this direction. So what I'm referring to is the connection between the 10 martyrs, who, by the way, the 10 martyrs is not a historical event that happened one afternoon. It took place over a great deal of time. But there is this understanding that the 10 martyrs are in fact connected to Mechirat Yosef. As I said, that's again, all that makes it into the things that we say. And as I said, that's interesting. That's where the Rekanati is going down with this. Vayom Yaakov ben Avisvu v'dilachem et asher yikra etchem b'achrit yomim ramaz lahem amash yikra lahem ba'atzmam al Mechirat Yosef. And he reads the entire section of the quote-unquote brachot, showing where the Aseret Ruge Malchut are actually embedded in the text over here. So as I said, it's a little bit further than I wanted to get to today, but I just want you to know about here, one of those outer limits of how you take all of this. He understands Acharit Yamim is after the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, when this crime of Mechirat Yosef still exists. But there's something which is really important about that, and that is that when we're talking over here, again, especially just bringing this right after the Das Kainim and making this observation that Yaakov looks up and says, but there's no chait over here. So, amnam? Like, really? There's no chait over here? Really? There's nothing hovering above? And it's that point which I think is going to be so important for us to come back and to try to understand. So, we now realize that the direction that all of this has taken us to ultimately is we circle back to where we always expect to be, and that is back to Yosef. Because all roads lead to Yosef. That we already know. So if we look at the very end of Bereshit, of Parshat Vayichi, source 17, Vayom Yosef Elachav Anochi Met. This is it. This is the very end. Velokim pakod yifkod etchem. And God is going to, the phrase, the double phrase of pakod and yifkod is so interesting because just as a starting point, what in the world does the word actually mean? What is the etymology? What is it communicating? So we will read this as pakod yifkod, God will remember you. Right? God remembered Sarah. God remembers people, right? We use the word pakad, God pakad, but it's not necessarily what the word means. Yeah, we use it that way, but it's not necessarily the meaning of it. But he says God is going to remember you. There's a word which is called a pikadon. What's a pikadon? It's collateral. It's collateral. It means that I am going to take something from you, but I'm going to take some, right? I'm going to give it back to you, and so on. What an interesting idea of the Jews being in Egypt is seen essentially as a pikadon. This is not your natural place. This is not really where you live. This is not where you're supposed to be. But the pikadon at some point is going to be returned home. At some point, the pikadon is going to go back. So I'm just saying the pikadon concept is really, really interesting. But there's some other moving parts over here which are so important that we need to understand. Yosef does something dramatic right here that we need to pay attention to. It's source 17. Those are not my sources, which is why you're lost. Okay. If you want, you give me those and I can try to teach that, but that's not what I had intended. So let me explain to you first why this is dramatic. And the first part of what I'm going to say, which means there's two sides of the coin over here. One side I've taught before, one side I haven't. So first the part which I have, and by the way, I just figure that everybody here has listened to, what is it, how many shiurim do we have online? There's a lot. So I just figured everyone's listened to all of them, so I can just, it's like sometimes people come over and say, oh, I have your book. What? All your books. I say, 14 of them? Oh, I didn't realize. I said, okay, good. So listen to all your classes also. It's the same kind of thing. So let's get back to our point, because there's something which is incredibly dramatic. From the moment we met Yosef, well, when he's born already, there is drama right there. We're born, he's off, Yaakov's living in Lavan's house. Yosef is born, time to go home. There's a power. The same pasuk. Yosef is born, time to go home. So now, there's something about Yosef, about going back home. Keep that in mind. Yosef, then, we really get to know him more in Parshat Vayichi. And Yosef immediately has his dreams. And it seems as if for the next, I don't know, what do you want to say, for the next 10 chapters or so, 37 to 47, that the dominant issue in the background are Yosef's dreams. And we keep on wondering, is that all that Yosef is really concerned about? Is that the point? Is Yosef just trying to make his dreams come true? Is that what it is? And yes, there's a Ramban which seems to go in that direction, and we talked about this a little bit, correct. And then that famous other point of the Ramban, again, connected, where the Ramban argues, again, we did all this, where the Ramban argues that Yosef sees the dreams as prophecy, and he says, otherwise, you'd have to ask why Yosef never contacted his parents, which all the Balei Tos would ask. And his father, I don't think it's a good question. I think that Yosef did. I think Yosef had to be very careful. When right here in this week's parsha, when Yaakov dies, Yosef has to go seek permission just to go to his father's funeral. That I think that Yosef is like every other Jewish leader who lived in a country other than his, and that is being accused of dual loyalty. And Yosef had to be especially careful of this. And Yosef starts sending secret messages to his father. It could have cost him his life. I don't think. Again, I think the more that you think about it, it's not a question of just sending an email, sending a postcard, sending a fax, sending a text. Yosef sending somebody means he has to trust somebody completely and not get intercepted, and the other person doesn't get arrested, and doesn't get tortured, and doesn't give information. And Yosef sending a message to his father, I think, could end his life. Again, I don't think I'm overstating this, but I think that there's a challenge over here. There's a challenge of somebody being a leader who's Jewish in other countries. I'll just mention that this past week, a great Jewish leader passed away, American Jewish leader. His name was Dr. Seymour Lackman. He was a personal friend. And the thing is that he was the first of what other people did, and he did it first, and he may have done it best. And you can look up exactly who it is. He's on Wikipedia. He was the president of the Board of Education in New York City, back when John Lindsay was mayor. And John Lindsay, he wouldn't answer his phone on Shabbos. So John Lindsay would drive to Brooklyn, drive to Bensonhurst, and knock on his door, and then sit down in his living room if he had to talk to him about something, because he wouldn't answer his phone on Shabbos. And then he became a four-term state senator in New York. And I'm saying not just Shomer Shabbos, far more than that, in terms of his commitment to Judaism and Jewish values and Jewish education and Jewish causes. And again, that claim in the back of always that fear of dual loyalty is something which is very difficult to do. And I wish that every Jewish politician in America right now knew how to stand on the right side, especially after October 7th and so on. And enough, מספיק, לא צריכים להגיד יותר מזה, המבין יבין. But I'm saying, just to say, oh yeah, Yosef could have done anything he wanted. He's the most powerful guy, really, unless he missteps and there are people out to get him, or less a perceived misstep, and the next thing you know, that doesn't necessarily work out very well for him. So we're going to try again now. Yosef, as far as we can tell, all the way through this whole thing, his major motivation was his dreams, that they're going to bow down to him, and so on and so forth. And it seems so obsessive almost that we really don't know what to do with it. So that's why I want to stop. The end of Bereshit is a full stop, and Yosef speaks. and he says something, I'm going to say it again, completely dramatic. And what is it that he says? Doesn't say a word about his dreams. He says something said about a different dream, a dream that Avram Avinu had, a dream that Avram Avinu had all the way back in Parak Ted Vav, and that was the Brit Bein Abtarim. And the Brit Bein Abtarim is that you're going to be enslaved and you're going to be abused in a land which isn't yours, and then God is going to take you out. You're going to leave Baruch Shkadel with great wealth, and then you're going to the land which God has promised. And that's what Yosef is talking about over here. Pakod Yivkod Etchem V'Le'etchem Min Haaretz Hazot Ela Haaretz Asher Nishba L'Avim Liyitzchak L'Yaakov. You're going to go back to the land. So just pause for a second. How does Yosef's life end? His brothers, who probably see him as a narcissist, probably think that he's completely Egyptian, probably imagine and remember how much Egypt is involved in life after death or death after death or things about death. Yosef should be building himself a pyramid in order to commemorate Yosef's life. He should have his own pyramid and take his place in the pantheon of Egyptian leaders, the impact that he had upon the country. And instead of all of that, what does Yosef say? Again, this is how we end Sefer Bereshit, and that's why, again, I'm going to say it's dramatic. Vayishba Yosef et bnei Yisrael lemor pakod yifkod Elokim etchem, that God is going to remember you. By the way, now think back about this term, even collateral, is just so interesting. Velitim et atzmotai mizeh, and take my remains out. Yosef says, again, something really moving and really important and really Zionist. There's this great midrash that says that Yosef in Gematria is Tzion. That Yosef is Tzion. And that Yosef says, I want to go home. Right? Enough of all this. That's it. That's how the story ends. I want to go home. And when you leave, and you're going to leave, and how do I know you're going to leave? Because God promised you're going to leave. This is the Brit. This is the covenant that God made with Avram Avinu. And suddenly you realize that Yosef's own personal dreams, whatever, all that is lost on the side. And by the way, it's actually going to be a reason for us to start to perhaps reinterpret everything. But Yosef says, I want to go home. I want to leave. And again, you want to make a stronger moral argument. I was kidnapped from my home. Take me back. You have a moral obligation of taking me back home. And that's what Yosef is doing over here at the end. So Yosef, as much as perhaps he's been separated from his brothers, first geographically and then perhaps emotionally, so much so that the verses right before this is where they are frightened of him and they said, please make us slaves, essentially really means don't kill us. So there is this real emotional separation between them. And the next thing that we find is Yosef saying, oh yeah, guys, when you leave, I'm going with you. I'm with you. So maybe they never saw that. I can't believe they saw that, and they would have said, please make us slaves. I can't believe that. So let's now go a little bit further. When we move over to Sefer Shemot, just notice something now. In source 18, Perek Gimel, God says, this is by the burning bush, Lech va'asaftet. By the way, va'asfu, remember we just had that term? Gather together. Gather together. Go, and what should you say to them? Pakod pakadati etchem. That God says, I remember. I remember. And that the time has come now in order to get up to the next chapter. When Moshe complains that he can't speak, one of the things he says is, ki kavad peh. So there are those who that he has some kind of a speech impediment. There are those who argue that what he is saying, because it's not the same, he doesn't say the same thing each time. He says something here, and then later on he uses a different phrase. So kavad peh, there are those who argue that he can't say the letter peh. And if he can't say the letter peh, then what can't he say? Pakod pakadati. Right, there are other people who can't say P also, right? Which is very interesting. He can't say Pe, Kavad Pe. I can't say the Pe. So if he can't say the Pe, then what can't he do? He can't do what God just asked him to do, to say Pakod Pakadati.
He can't say let my people go.
Right. I'm saying, right. He can't say that. He can't say Paro. Now, there are those who point out that the word poked, actively to remember, is in Gematria 190. So therefore, Chishevet HaKetz and poked, it's the same thing, and therefore this already is the hint when Yosef says, no, you're going to cut out, and the time is it's not going to be the 400 years, rather, pakot pakadati. Again, within those words, and that's the secret. There's also a more dramatic midrash about this in source 21. It's based on 20. Gather them all together. Look at Pasuk Lamed now. So what is it? Is it what wins them over? Is it what he says, or all the miracles? Again, the focus over here are on those same words that Yosef said. In source 21, it goes through the same thing again. So maybe they're not going to believe it until they see the signs. Lo. The main focus is they heard. It's the pakad. The pakad is the point. And then it says, it's they heard the message, not what they saw. What do they believe? Al siman hapkida. שאמר להם שכך היה מסורת בידם מיעקב, שיעקב מסר את הסוד ליוסף ויוסף לאחיו. That according to this midrash, this was passed on, and then to Asher ben Yaakov, מסר את הסוד לשרח ביתו. And according, this is that source that when they came, עדיין היא קיימת, וכך אמר לו גואל שיבוא ויאמר לו בני פקוד פקדתי אתכם, הוא גואל של אמת, כיוון שבא משה ואמר פקוד פקדתי אתכם, מיד ויאמן העם, במאמינו כי שמעו הפקידה. הדכתיב כי פקד השם מפני ישראל, וכי ראה את עוניים ויקדו וישתחוו. Which means this whole thing that I've been trying to work out here is there is this major focus on not just that Yosef says that, oh, God is going to save you. It's not just the Brit Bein Abtarim is there in the background. It's there. I mean, you can't miss that. That is the content of what Yosef is saying. But there are those who see, no, it's Yosef's words, or now is the time. And by the way, this is exactly the challenge. How do you count 400 years? At what point is it time to go? At what point is God really going to remember us? At what point is God going to say that, no, there is a pikadon over here. It's in the wrong place. It's time to go home. And now I'm going to point out what I said in passing in source 22, Vayihi miketz shnatayim yamim. The word miketz was there. And with Yosef as well, we can begin to wonder, because this is the very difficult thing, this is where Rashi tells us that Yosef, he had entrusted his hope with the Sarah Mashkim, and therefore God counts another 2 years. And again, when is the end of Yosef's days of being in slavery in Egypt? And now I deliberately say that because there is something over here that we finally have to recognize. And once we recognize this, then everything changes. In source number 23, Vayosef Yerad Tchila L'Mitzrayim L'Kayem Gzera Shenigzera Ala Zaken Shenemar Va'avdum Ve'inu Otam. So I want to stop right there. The story of Yosef going down to Egypt, in very broad strokes, is the story of the Jews who are going to now fulfill this idea of being strangers in a land which isn't theirs, or more specifically, of being enslaved and being abused. But let's stop and think for a second. Maybe the way that we normally process this is that we need some kind of a path whereby the brothers, and for that matter, the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of Yaakov, are going to end up in Egypt. So this is how God chooses to send them there. Which means the main thing is that at some point the slavery will begin. Again, if you do all the math, you look at the commentaries, I think they end up being in Egypt a total of 210 years, and they end up being enslaved a total of 86 years, and that's part of, again, all of the divine math that takes place. But now I want to suggest that there's another way of reading this. And this is the part which is more frightening, and this is the part that we haven't thought about, and this is where we come back to Schrödinger's cat, or at least, as I said, his theological cat. I mean, Schrödinger, again, I don't want to talk about subatomic, and I don't want to talk about about all of the issues within physics and quantum physics and so on. Because, I say these words, I don't even know what any of them means. I mean, I don't know the difference between Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and Schrödinger's cat. So, and I'm sure someone's going to come and, what? Exactly. So let's now think all over again. This midrash actually said something. Source 24 says it. It's just a lot more complicated to break through source 24. And source 25 tries to unpack source 24. And essentially what it's saying, again, let's read the Eitz Yotzev. He's one of the commentaries on Bereshit Rabbah. He writes, Ki yeshever zerav shora shever v'sever. So it's playing a term, is it a shin or a sin, or is it a sin, or is it a samach? V'shever hu miloshin shivron. Kinyan hara'av, Inyan Yosef shurad Mitzrayim, Vinyan Gzeret v'avdum v'inu otam. That's not an accident. What it's telling you is that when Yosef goes down, that's the beginning of this, that prophecy taking place. In source 27 and 29, which are both the Chidah is going to double down on this. But again, I have to finally explain what it is they're doubling down on and what it is that they're saying, because we're kind of missing the message over here. Yosef went down to Egypt. Yosef was enslaved. Yosef was abused. In fact, I'm going to argue that Yosef was enslaved the entire time that he was there, but his conditions changed multiple times. He was enslaved by Potiphar. He was enslaved in the prison, and then he's enslaved by Paro. Again, don't think, just as I said, his conditions changed. So now when the brothers come down, how do they look at Yosef? So I'm going to finally ask the more difficult question. Do they recognize that Yosef already experienced slavery, torture, abuse? Or do they not see this at all? Should I ask the question in a stronger sense? And this is the part which I think is really difficult. Do they look at Yosef's slavery as their slavery? Or do they look at this as, we got rid of this annoying person. We got rid of this dangerous person. Which means the Mechirat Yosef is essentially a complete rejection of Yosef. Can we go into Yosef's mind right now? We had every reason to believe, and we looked at the Midrashim that said this. If you want, we could double down on some of them. That Yaakov believed that his time with Lavan was the time of Va'avdum, V'inuoto, but it was 4 generations. Okay, that's the minimum, 4 generations. So 4th generation, now it's Yosef is born, and now it's time to come back, that Yaakov himself already went through. And that's what the Midrash means when it says, V'bikesh Yaakov l'shevet b'shalva. He thought, we've done everything. Now we came back to the land of Israel, B'rechush gadol, with all the money that he made from Lavan. And instead what happens is, what does it say? Kafzo lo v'rogzo shel Yosef. And essentially, the divine message is, are you kidding? We haven't even started yet. That was just, a trial run. We haven't started. And there is a lot to compare between Yaakov leaving Lavan and the Jews subsequently leaving Egypt. The Vilna Gaon says every single element is the same. I don't know how many I counted so far. I think at least 20 different elements that are similar, the same. But again, that's quite important. But nonetheless, maybe even Elo told us Yaakov Yosef, and Yosef goes down, and Yosef is enslaved, and Yosef starts experiencing this, and Yosef then says to himself, I will fulfill the slavery. I will fulfill this divine, what do you want to call this? This covenant, our side of the covenant. And I'm not writing any letters, I'm not contacting anybody. I am willing to go through this, and I'm willing to absorb this, and I am going to take all of this upon myself. And then at some point, the brothers come down. And again, God's decision is, Yosef, good start. That's not it yet. But now the question, and this is why it's fungible, and this is why it's complicated, and this is why Yaakov perhaps doesn't know when the Kates is. He doesn't know when they're getting out because there's something which is still a moving part. Are you with me on this? This is the only important part of the whole share. Because Yaakov doesn't know because there's something which hasn't happened yet. And what's that? They have not accepted, as of this point, Yosef's suffering and Yosef's slavery, which means that the suffering and slavery only begin at a subsequent point in time. And the way that we count is from that subsequent point in time, which means they're going to have to stay a lot longer. It's only at the point that they're able to accept that what Yosef went through, that his pain is their pain, and his slavery was their slavery, which means that the covenant that God made with Avram had already begun with Yosef being the slave. If that's the case, we can start counting much earlier, and then we can leave much earlier. And therefore, it's not until Yosef's last breath, when he tells them, I want to go out with you, I'm not staying here, when that's the beginning of this reconsideration of who Yosef is and everything about him. When Moshe Rabbeinu carries Yosef out, that's just a completely different relationship. Maybe personally, Moshe felt he owed Yosef a lot. He's the only one who ever lived in a palace right? He lived in a palace as an Egyptian leader, as Moshe later does. But I don't think it's just personal. I think it's that Moshe understands what Yosef actually did and the ability that God can say that now the time has come to leave is only because at this point OUisrael now has accepted Yosef, and because now go back to the beginning. To the very beginning. What does Yaakov say? Gather together. Unify. Stand together around my bed. Later on, the Medrash is going to say when they march out of Egypt, they're going to march out in the same formation that they were around his bed. Let me just throw out a couple of last sources, and then we'll end with this. In the source 31, when Yaakov sends Yosef to looking for the brothers, it says Me'ei Chevron. Already there, Rashi points out, what's Ei Chevron? Chevron is on a hill. Elamei Eitz Amuka Shel Oto Tzadik HaKavur BeChevron L'Kayima Shenemar LaAvram Bein Abtarim. The Brit Bein Abtarim begins today. As soon as Yaakov sends Yosef on his mission, this really is the beginning of this. So I'm saying Rashi already had pointed this out. If you look at the Bereshit Rabbah in 34, here, Vayomer, Hey Asfu, Rabbanim Amitzivotam Ala Machloket, Amar Lem Tiyu Kulchem Asifa Achat. No more arguments, no more fighting. Come together and join as one. And I'm going to go back and say it again. Why is it so important to join as one? Because if Yosef is independent, if Yosef's experiences, if Yosef's suffering, if all the things Yosef went through is not their problem, is not their experience, then all of this is absolutely not going to work. I mean, more than that, we can point out again something which I think is interesting. If you look at, continuing that midrash, it goes to what we should recognize from the Haftarah. And it says, Tu kulchem asifa achad, hainu tizlevatem ben adam kach lecha eitz achad, uktov alav l'nei Yisrael. That's the Eitz Yosef and the Eitz Yehuda. It's one tree. The two leaders work together. Don't work separately. Don't be fighting with one another. V'asita otam l'goy echad. In source 35, it uses a great term. It uses when Vayomer Moshe avadecha, right? Go to war. V'lo nifkad mimenu ish. No person should be left behind. Again, kind of like as a collateral. Look at the Baal HaTurim. He uses that pasuk right over here, pakod yifkod, pirish, ani basar v'damet, v'melech chai v'kayam yifkod etchem, v'amar pakod yifkod, lo shalom nifkad mimenu ish. That you, again, this idea of God remembering is that you are collateral and no one's going to be left behind. All of this is together. And if you look at the Haftarah that we read when Shabbat Nachamu, right, after the destruction, after the problem, after the Sinat Chinam, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, and how does that Haftarah end? Ish lo ne'edar, right? Nobody could be left behind. So now we think about how Bereshit ends. Maybe the brothers would have had such an easy time to leave Yosef behind. They try to get rid of him once. He's not part of their story. He's not part of their family. He's not part of that narrative. There is something we talked about a year or two ago. We talked about narrative therapy. Narrative therapy, when you go back and then you reinterpret the events in your life, and sometimes it can be very healing when you were able to reassign certain emotions with things that took place, that in the context it was terrible. In context, Mechirat Yosef was a terrible sin. And as we again were reminded today, the implications of that sin is one that follows us and haunts us, and there's price to be paid. The Rambam says that when it says that you bring a sir izim lachatat by every single holiday, it's because every single holiday family gathers together, and we keep in mind about that member of the family that we threw away, and that's Mechirat Yosef, when they took his clothing and dipped it into a goat. So there's always going to be a goat as a sin offering. But over here, no. Gather together, no one's left behind. So who's the no one who can't be left behind? It's the first Pikadon that was sent down to Egypt. Don't interpret that as, no, he's not part of the family. Interpret it the other way around. He is part of the family. Not only is he part of the family, his suffering was your suffering. And only once you feel that, then the whole divine math changes. And at that point, we can leave Israel, we can leave Egypt earlier and begin our trip back to Israel. And that exactly is one of the secrets, again, of Jewish theology, of what we say in the Karayot and why the wicked. Do we feel other people's pain? Well, no, that's somebody else's pain. That's someone else's problem. When we feel someone else's pain and that becomes our pain, and there's also a theory of conservation of pain. There's only so much pain that God wants us to go through. But sometimes we don't feel other people's pain. And there's a profound problem with this. Once they process this and they go through their narrative therapy, and how interesting that on Pesach we have to go through a narrative and tell over the story. But once we understand the story properly, and then we realize the role that Yosef played in all of this, it wasn't just as the rich uncle who sent some food for us. It was long before he became the rich uncle. He suffered greatly. And we don't even realize that when he was the rich uncle, he was still suffering greatly. And the last moment of life, he says, by the way, I'm with you. This is just a job. I want to go home. Chazak, chazak, and it's chazak.